My name's Natasha Chuk. I teach in the art history department here at SVA. This is Dina Kantor. She also teaches at SVA, and she's a photographer. We're each going to talk about our work individually, and then we're going to have a conversation together, and then we'll open this up for questions to any of you or comments if you have them. So thank you very much for attending tonight, coming out in the snow, being here. I'd also like to thank the departments that sponsored this evening. Visual and Critical Studies, as well as the MFA Photography, Video, and Related Media Department, and of course, Dina, for being here and being a part of my book. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about my book and how Dina's work relates to these central themes, and then, like I said, Dina will take it over from there. So let me get started. So my book is called Vanishing Points, Articulations of Death, Fragmentation, and the Unexperienced Experience of Created Objects, which was published last year by Intellect books. It's a work that's derived from my doctoral dissertation research project where I became really fascinated and studied the relationship between presence and absence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about the way presence and absence work in art and how through this relationship they're able to construct experiences that are otherwise unexperienceable, including things like death. So this is my book cover, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. It does a number of things to engage the nature of this relationship across a variety of media objects that I analyze, and there's a whole gamut of things, paintings, video games, interactive art, film, and I spend some time also talking about photography, and that's what I'll focus on when Dina and I turn our conversation over to her work. Some of the philosophical themes that are addressed are through literary constructs, and this is really important because I use Maurice Blanchot's book called The Instant of My Death, which is a semi-autobiographical account of his narrow escape from death during World War II, from which Jacques Derrida derived the idea and the functionality of what he calls unexperienced experience. So this is a term that might be new to you. It's not very commonly known, but I really use it as the driving force in this book. And basically what it is the result of the created object's conflation, so this kind of like dynamic between truth and fiction. It's neither wholly truthful, neither wholly fictional, so it's somewhere in the middle. Blanchot escapes the experience of his own death in this literary text through this technique of giving material form, of course literature, to the impossible experience, which is death. And in doing so, he both testifies to his death and denies its possibility. So the reproducibility of this creation allows us, the readers, to experience this fusion, but only from a removed secondary position. Basically then, readers are able to construct a version of his near-death experience. So I use this concept, as I said, as something that drives this work. Derrida's notion as well of the crypt as part of this, which he describes as something that disguises the act of hiding and hides the disguise. These two concepts, of course, come together to focus on works that I've identified, and there are so many, I had to limit myself here, that value, sometimes inadvertently, the engagement between presence and absence, and by extension, create a more involved constitution of a singular vanishing point. This is why it's called Vanishing Points, which elicit a clear conceptual vantage point and perspective for understanding. So when we complicate that, of course, I like to think about this in terms of how orientation is left up for grabs. But before I continue, let me explain what I mean by this relationship between presence and absence and how I'm defining both of them. I will bring this image up, which is a very famous, one of the most famous examples of this relationship, I would say, Robert Rauschenberg's celebrated work of negation, Erased de Kooning from 1953. It's a work that invites viewers to contemplate quite literally the presence of absence. Moreover, it acts as a crypt in the way that Derrida describes, disguising the act of hiding and hiding the disguise, except it addresses erasure in its title and testifies to it in its rubbed surface. It shows, in fact, it admits that it hides, but it doesn't altogether show what it hides. In other words, it illustrates absence and thus illustrates its presence. Other people have, of course, written about this relationship in a number of ways, addressing what composes presence and absence. In his book, No Medium, Craig Dorkin writes, Rauschenberg manifests that erasure is itself a kind of drawing. And it thus reminds the viewer that there are no real absences, only replacements of one layer by another, precessions of opacities, and cancellations of competing materials, each with their own revelations and supersessions in turn. So these so-called revelations and supersessions serve to confuse linearity and dismiss resolution. Where does de Kooning's work end and Rauschenberg's begin? These are the questions that I'm asking of this and other works. So this idea of the single vanishing, of course, gives us orientation, allows us to understand the relationship between objects, of course, in this illustration. But even conceptually, it helps us understand the dynamic of the work. In my book, I describe this in the following way, adding considerations of how one might orient oneself toward this work's vanishing point. And by that, I mean Robert Rauschenberg's, or rather resolve to accept a multiplicity of vanishing points. So then I like to think more of like a constellation of vanishing points. Defaced and relegated to the realm of the invisible, the purity and unscathed form of the original artist's work is replaced with its successors, becoming the material site of an irreversible violent event brought on by the act of a prankster and vandal. Rauschenberg's canvas operates on the level of parading negation and conceals a constellation of vanishing points. One of these points of orientation is the elected creator of the artwork, a charge that appears to be twofold but remains inconclusive. It is the elected creator of the artwork, strictly speaking, the work's creator is neither wholly de Kooning nor wholly Rauschenberg. It would be more accurate to label it a collaborative piece, indicating both artists were complicit in its creation. De Kooning's contribution involves the application of numerous layers of paint, chalk, pencil, etc. to the small canvas, and Rauschenberg's, of course, involves the active removal of these works in what might be best described as a process of undoing. Again, this is sort of this idea of creating through erasure. The work, of course, with new invisible marks. But it's difficult to argue that this work is categorically bare, giving it another indecipherable point of orientation. Within every rubbed fiber of the canvas lies a violent past suggested in part by its title and the faint outline of the original. This is the crux of the artwork's deception, predicated on obscurity and artifice, hiding from viewers the details of its path to contemplation. With premeditated mischief, Rauschenberg created this canvas of absence with de Kooning's permission, having from the outset acknowledged his intention to destroy it. Yet the invisible de Kooning sentiment lives on through the new work, buried beneath its erasure and advertised within its title, almost like an epitaph. So this duality exists most dramatically through the bruised surface of the piece. It's hard to see here, of course, but if you were to look at this work up close, it really becomes evident that it's been through something, and you could say tortured. These are flecked with battle scars and, of course, the marks of the strenuous labor with which Rauschenberg's murderous act took place. And they can be understood as well as symbolic lashings that mark numerous ends and beginnings. This act creates a wave of vanishing points that at once obscures and gives form to this erasure. Each stroke of removal is like a singular event of negation, indicating the end of one significant work and, of course, the coming together of its successful replacement. To be sure, what increases the significance of the latter is its containment of a particular absence. The absence of de Kooning's original marks, the symbolic erasure of death of de Kooning himself, the invisibility of the two artists' arrangement, and the invisibility of violence necessary to carry out the object's erasure. In an artwork like this, it's pretty clear that presence and absence have this strong relationship, and it's even hard to miss. But then how does this work in other works of art that are maybe less into advertising this idea of erasure? I see in a lot of things, and in my book I talk about this. Caleb Larson's A Truth to Deceive and Slaughter, which is a nondescript black box programmed to perpetually sell itself as a work of art on eBay. I see it also in Namjoon Paik's Zen for Film, an endless loop of unfilmed leader casting frame light on a surface but never reaching resolution. And I also see it in Christian Marclay's work, which unbinds the logical framework of time and employs fragmentation in a quilted assemblage, which we find in this film that he made, assemblage of found footage in the clock. And perhaps most notably, this relationship takes shape in a multitude of ways in photography. Roland Barthes, among others, famously wrote about his struggle with finding his mother in photographs in camera lucida, particularly after her death. He writes, "I had acknowledged that fatality, one of the most agonizing features of mourning, which decreed that however often I might consult such images, I could never recall her features, summon them up as a totality." And then he continues by saying, "I never recognized her except in fragments, which is to say that I missed her being, and that therefore I missed her altogether." Photographs allow this partiality and the recognition and capture of someone, a photograph's subject, as Barthes put it, differentially, not essentially. Despite this partiality, Barthes argues that photographs epitomize a strong and irrefutable truth. He distinguishes the photographs referent from other systems of representations as such. He says, I call photographic referent not the optionally real thing to which an image or a sign refers, but the necessarily real thing which has been placed before the lens, without which there would be no photograph. So put another way, they refer to real objects placed before the camera. Photography's reliance on this truth, this placement of an object before the camera in an event that happened in the physical world and experienced in real time, is the fundamental value of photographs and the image it materializes, creating what Barthes calls a superimposition of reality and of the past. As such, photographs admit as well as hide the truth or testimony, to use Derrida's word again, of a certain time, place, and experience. With additionally removed time, location, and the inexperience of the event firsthand, this gap possibly increases between what an image reveals and what it hides, recalling Derrida's notion of the unexperienced experience. This relation between engagement and remove is perhaps photography's most intriguing quality. On a basic level, it allows us to document the past and reflect on it in the future, as every photograph is always already a document of the past. The past, of course, rendered present in photographs, both suspends and permits its absence. And as Barthes put it, every photograph is a certificate of presence. So I want to move on to photography. Some photographers certainly build on this concept and further highlight the presence of absence. I see it a lot in Felix Gonzalez Torres's oversized images on billboards throughout New York City. These are images that approach the palpability of absence on the part of the viewer, both in scale, placement, and subject matter. These are just a few of these. They outline the presence of the individuals who made these impressions and thus highlights their absence. Not to mention the remove of seeing these in a completely different context in the city. We also see it in Lee Friedlander's work, especially his self-portraits, where his likeness is strategically hidden or tucked away in his environment, exacerbating the fragments already inherent in the photographic image. And according to Barthes, presenting viewers this riddled perspective, the self is visible but hidden, and thus unresolvable. And we also see it in Alex Soth's more recent work, which recalls Friedlander's self-portraits. In an age of rampant self-portraiture, more commonly known as selfies, the New York Times and others have remarked on how these photographs, dubbed unselfies of course, document and annihilate the image and also the likeness of the photographer. And I also think it's worth noting here the curiosity of the term selfie. The informality of the suffix added to self suggests a kind of pet name denoting belonging to or something having to do with, in this case, the self. And in this sense, the term selfie unknowingly acknowledges this fragmentation I was talking about and the removal observed by both Derrida and Barthes. So finally, this is all central to Dina Kantor's work. This photographic series that I included in my book, Treece, a project that chronicles the disappearance of a small town in Kansas facing unincorporation and dissolution. The work, among other things, offers testimony to this event, and in doing so establishes for viewers an unexperienced experience of the disappearance, or this imminent death, if you will, of Treece and its displaced residents. Additionally, it offers an extension of these events, memorializing the town and its people in various ways. So I'll let Dina talk more about her project, and then we'll open it up to a discussion.
Thank you. Sure. Hi. Thank you to Natasha and also to both SVA's Visual and Critical Studies Department and the MFA Photography Department for hosting this. I'm really happy to be here. So to give you a little bit of pre-Treece. My work is always interested, I'm looking at how the camera contributes to our understanding of identity. And not just individual identity, but community identity. So before working in Treece, I've worked on a number of different projects where I've examined those things and those different kinds of issues. With Treece, I'm a complete outsider. I didn't know anyone in the town. I know nothing of what was happening besides what I read about in an article which brought me there in the first place. And so I was interested in going there and starting this work because I saw it as an opportunity to examine a shifting identity of a culture and a community, knowing that this town was about to go through this process of no longer existing, and imagining what it would be like to grow up in a space where you always identified with the town's history and then to all of a sudden not have that exist anymore. So I began photographing in Treece in 2010, right after Obama signed a bill approving a $3.5 million buyout of the town. And so to orient you a little bit, this is Treece itself. It's this teeny tiny little town of 4x5 blocks. These roads that are kind of around Treece, there were people who lived on these roads and they were hooked up to the Treece water system, but officially this is Treece itself. And this road here is called State Line Street, and that's actually the state line that brings you across the street into Oklahoma. So right across that road, you would then be in a town that was called Pitcher, Oklahoma, and then if you headed east a bit, you would get to Missouri. So this is all part of what was referred to as the tri-state mining area. And the region was mined for lead and zinc and iron and was really, like, business was booming during mostly the two world wars. Treece and Pitcher together produced about $20 billion worth of ore. And the last of the mines ended up closing in the 1970s and left behind a small community, or smallish community, of children and grandchildren of miners and people who were there for that purpose. So the story of Treece is very much tied to the story of Pitcher, and I'll explain that a little bit going forward. Pitcher did at one point have a population of about 20,000 people, so it was a much larger town. This is a satellite image of Treece itself. Once again, here's that small little 4x5 block area, and where Pitcher would begin over here. And what you're seeing are those white blobs that surround the town. Those are what are referred to as chat piles. And basically what chat is the mining companies went underground, they dug up everything that they wanted to get the lead and the zinc out of it, brought it above ground and made these massive mountains for them to then sift through all the gravel and the dirt and find the lead and the zinc and the things that they wanted. And of course, these massive piles still remain. Some of them are larger, as you can see, than Treece is itself. So a little bit about Treece. When I began working, the poverty level in Treece was more than twice the national average. There was a 2009 blood test run by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which found that 8.8% of children had elevated blood lead levels compared to just 2.9% statewide. So there was definitely an issue with that. And then not only that, but mistakes in mining practices left the ground in Treece unstable and susceptible to sinkholes. So again, the mining companies, once they left, they would leave sort of pillars of the earth to hold up this layer of ground, right? And then there were gougers that would come in and take out extra bits after the mining companies officially left so that they would get access to the lead and the zinc. And then the mining companies turned off their pumps that kept the water out of the mines. So then, of course, the mines flooded with water, and so the ground itself does actually cave in. I've heard stories of entire houses dropping straight down. I never saw that, did see plenty of other sinkholes throughout the process. This is a ledger that was part of the City Hall records, and the document that's on the first page is the original document incorporating the town of Treece. On February 26, 1918, Treece became a town, and it was incorporated just as a home for miners specifically. The town wouldn't have existed without the mining itself. So a lot of the people who I spoke with and that I met along the way never really considered the health hazards or the environmental risks as they were growing up until quite recently, until the EPA started coming in to clean it up. The chat piles were something they grew up with. It was just the landscape around them. This was something they were totally used to. So they would ride their bikes up and down the chat piles. They'd ride ATVs. They would go sledding down them in the winter. There are softball fields and baseball fields and picnic tables like right below the chat piles. And of course, the chat piles still have traces of lead in them. That's not completely all gone. So here is one of the images of a chat pile. And I knew going there that they existed. I'd read about them, I understood what chat piles were, but it still really struck me visually as I drove into town the first time. Kansas is this long flat land where you can see forever. And then coming into this region and seeing what feel like these mountains. And there is a beauty to them. And then of course, you think about what they are and what they mean. What you're seeing behind these girls in Treece that's not chat behind them actually, that's reclaimed land. So the EPA has been in the area since the 80s trying to clean up, and what they would do is basically remove the topsoil and then put new topsoil down, and that's them kind of cleaning up what's there. So that's remediated land behind them. The white sort of little structure behind the swing set has an air quality test in it, so they were constantly looking to see how much lead was in the air. This is also an area of reclaimed land, basically right where the boy is walking. There used to be a sinkhole, and I was told stories of kids going swimming in the sinkhole and swinging off the tree branches and jumping into the water and swimming, and then the kids would get what they thought was sunburn, but it turned out to be a reaction, of course, to the lead that was in the water. So the EPA came and filled it in and is filling in the sinkholes constantly. This is a creek called Tar Creek, and what you're seeing is where some fresh water is kind of mixing with some contaminated water from the lead, and where the lead has actually stained the earth as well. Tar Creek is actually the name of the Superfund site that Treece is a part of. It's the largest Superfund site in the United States. Here we're actually on top of one of the chat piles. It's called Fisher's Chat. All of the local people named the chat piles unofficially, different names that everybody knows. So we're up on Fisher's Chat, and what you're seeing is where Pitcher, Oklahoma used to be as well. And I mentioned that Treece's history is very much linked to Pitcher. Pitcher obviously was much larger. When I started in Treece, it was mostly residential. There was a church, the city hall, and a small tire retreading company there. Otherwise, it's people's homes. In Pitcher, there were bars and restaurants and pharmacies and lots of things happening there. And so again, the EPA has been in the whole region trying to clean up since the 80s. In 1993, there was a study that found that 34% of children tested in Pitcher had blood lead levels that exceeded the point at which there's a risk for brain or nervous system damage. And that's when the cleanup really kind of swung more into high gear and became a big issue. And then in the early 2000s, there was a big tornado that came through, and I think the EPA kind of got frustrated. It derailed a lot of what they'd been doing, and they came to the conclusion that it would actually be safer for the residents and it would be faster and easier for them to just get the people out, and they would be able to clean up easier. So what you're looking at now is, or in this photograph, is after the buyout of Pitcher, Oklahoma happened, but before everything was completely taken and removed. So the houses are gone, but obviously you can still see the grid of the roads, and of course just how many chat piles do exist in the area. So as I said, it showed you the map where literally Treece is across the street from Pitcher. And so people who lived in Treece kind of thought, well, if it's not safe for people to be in Pitcher, it's not safe for us to be here. We're just across the street. But because that street was a state line, they weren't included in the buyout of Pitcher. And beyond just the safety issue, their lives changed drastically once Pitcher disappeared. They now had to go a half an hour away to get bread or gas or things like that. It was a big shift for them. So in 2006, a handful of people, including the mayor at the time and the city clerk, signed a resolution, and they actually petitioned the government for their own buyout and said, we want to no longer be a town and would like to get funding to help us leave. if you live in a Superfund site, your home is basically worth zero, right? No one's going to come and buy your home and let you leave and have you move somewhere else. So a lot of people were, for lack of a better word, stuck. Whether they wanted to go or not, they didn't have the ability to go financially unless they just had the money to go on their own, which was rare. The buyout itself was voluntary. When I started photographing, Obama had proved the buyout, like I said, and the residents knew it was coming, but they didn't really know exactly what it was going to entail and what that process would be. There was a trust committee that was established that oversaw the plans and organized all of the finance and figured everything out. And again, it was voluntary. You didn't have to leave if you didn't want to. But if you were going to stay, you needed to be able to afford hooking yourself up to new water and septic. And that was about $5,000. The man who is in this photograph told me that he bought that house for about $2,000 when he bought it. So to have an extra $5,000 was something that wasn't really feasible for a lot of the people who lived there. This was the mayor bill in front of the city hall. He worked as mayor and was paid $1 a year. He actually had a full-time job working at a dog food factory, but this was his love job. You know, he wanted to be doing that. Vicky and Clyde in this picture, they're the only people who actually told me that they were nervous about the land collapsing. Of everyone who I met, most people were kind of like, well, I've lived here long enough. If it's in me, it's in me. Like, what am I gonna do? And there was no necessary, like, direct link to any health issues that people had, or they couldn't exactly tie it. So most people felt like it is what it is and I might want to stay here. They told me that when their kids were young, they were planting a tree in the backyard and all of a sudden they could hear water rushing and they could see the ground starting to fall. And so they quickly filled it in and said that they knew at any moment their house could fall down, but there was nothing they could do until the buyout came through and they had the funding that made them able to leave. Throughout the process of making my photographs, I've also been collecting different artifacts that kind of help tell the story in a different way. This is a mining postcard, which I then photographed on the chat itself. I've also collected family photographs and mining maps and other kinds of documents and things like that, which I'll show you. This was an abandoned house in Treece, actually, before the buyout even went through. So this is a little bit of what the landscapes looked like throughout the process. So I went to Treece and a number of times, and every time I went, I'd be there for a few weeks photographing like morning till night, and people changed their minds every time I was there, whether they were gonna stay or go. If you chose to leave, you could take your house with you, as some people did, especially if they had mobile homes, or you could leave it behind and just go do whatever you wanted to do. And then a lot of the homes that were left behind were sold at auction so that the trust and the government could recoup some of the costs. This is a woman named Jan's house. She moved to a new home in Oklahoma, but then her house was sold at auction. Someone else bought it and moved it to other land in Kansas. And after the auction, before the demolition happened, this is kind of what the landscape looked like. Some people would buy a home strictly to rip out the copper wiring or take the windows or door handles or things like that, knowing then that a demolition company was going to come through and tear it all down. And so, you know, the town looked a lot like this as the homes were waiting for demolition. The landscape really kind of shifted as I was going through. I photographed the water tower throughout every time I was going, sort of as a symbol. Here you can see there's now graffiti on it. It says "Fuck EPA." And that's the city hall from behind, and then a previous building that housed the city hall and apparently a jail. And this is the demolition of City Hall. In a sequence, there's one kind of larger. And I was there photographing, obviously, during the demolition. This is Donnie. He was part of the demolition crew. He's standing in front of what used to be a woman named, what used to be the house belonging to a woman named Catherine, who I also have photographed her standing in front of the house when it was whole. And the water tower was also sold at auction and taken down and sold for scrap metal. He was part of the demolition crew for the water tower. And here it is in a few different angles. So the town itself officially was dissolved in September 2011 with this bill, House Bill number 2412. And after that happened, people slowly moved at different points in time, and instead of just stopping and photographing in Treece, I continued to photograph as people moved to their new homes, and to look at what this identity shift might continue to be. This is Bill, the former mayor, again, on the land that he and his wife purchased. They brought their home with them. That's before the home was actually there, and this is them sitting in front of it a few months later. This is Dave, Pam, and Sherry. Pam on the far right was the city clerk, and when she and her husband left Treece, they moved next door to Dave's sister, Sherry, which I thought was a really beautiful way of kind of trying to continue having and reestablishing a sense of community as well. And Sherry, of course, had lived in Treece as well, but left a few years earlier. And that's Vicki and Clyde again in their new home in Galena, Kansas. They're the people who told me that the tree was, when they were planting a tree, it started to fall. And this is Della. She and her husband Red are the only people who chose to stay in Treece in the actual center of town. There were people who stayed on that like winding road up north that I was pointing out, but she and her husband actually elected to stay. They felt like, they owned their home outright. It would have cost them more to buy a new place. In fact, some people did take out mortgages and go into further debt, even though they had government money to go buy a new home. They still wasn't quite enough. So she decided to stay, and they're still there, and everyone else is gone. The only roads that are still there lead to her house now. Her husband Red, when the buyout or when the demolition was happening and after they ripped up the roads, he would walk around town and just kind of pick up things that were there. He filled 3 jars with marbles that were just laying on the ground. He also found a key to the former city hall and jail, which he has. This is a miner's song booklet that I photographed. This is Gary. He lives also on the north, that winding road just north of Treece. That again, he was eligible for the buyout because he was on the Treece water system, but decided to stay, and so did his family. Denny and Ella did as well. That's a mining can. Denny told me he learned how to drive in the mines, which I thought was a great story. And that's his son Jerry and his now wife Mandy. Jerry didn't actually even submit paperwork to be considered for the buyout. He's the only one who I know who just decided that he wasn't going to go no matter what from day one, and he knew that, and he was happy to stay. This is Madison and Trenton, who I showed you in the very beginning, and this is them actually back on the land where their house used to be after it was torn down. And a few more families moving forward into their new homes. This is actually 4 generations, missing one, who live together in a new home. And Randy and Trendle also moved to a new home. And this is an image that I shot in 2013 of the vacant land after the homes had been demolished and the roads ripped up. The town itself, the land itself, was actually sold at auction as well in February 2014. It was split up into 10 parcels of land, and the majority of it was the city of Treece itself. Some of it was around it, and there was an environmental use control restricting the use of the property, so you could buy it, but you couldn't live on it, but it could be used for habitat of livestock and grazing, things like that, but not for human living, and you weren't allowed to do anything to disturb the vegetation. Most of the land was actually purchased by a local Native American tribe called the Quapaw tribe, who has that right now, and I've been told by someone who lives there that right now it's just like weeds and deer, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen with it. The auction income for the land was $12,199.50, and the trust that oversaw the buyout of the whole process officially disbanded on May 22nd, 2014. I think this might be a good point to start talking. I have a few other things we can look at. But.
Sure. So we just want to spend a few minutes talking about how and where our work overlaps, and I hope some of it is evident. I hope some of it is pretty clear. Dina and I actually had a long conversation as I was writing my book, and sort of an informal interview situation where I got a lot of this information, and her project was still developing. So what's interesting to me, of course, is this relationship between, naturally these photographs give us so much evidence of what happened, but they also, collectively they have this sort of this quality of documentation, but also, memorializing this town. And so I want you to talk a little bit about, if you would, this relationship between, what the photographs tell us and what they don't. So when you look at a single image like this, for example, there's nothing about this that indicates this was the site of a town, or people used to call this home or anything like that. So this relationship between like sort of what's missing in images and what's so valuable about taking these, and of course telling the stories around them.
Sure. I think that's one of the interesting things about photography, and hopefully a lot of art, that it isn't just about answering questions, it's about asking a lot of them. And I think that so many times, or I hope that nothing ever is so straightforward in any of my work that you have no questions, and it doesn't create any kind of intrigue and wonder, yes, this could just be an interesting landscape with dirt and whatnot going on in it, but then having that information to back it up is really what activates, I think, some of the photographs. I think that this is what a photograph can do, right? I mean, there's not much. You mentioned Barth in there's a lot of things that I think about with this work and things that he wrote, but I think that, there isn't much that can be done in a photograph besides record what stood in front of it. And yes, that does sort of in front of the camera, and that does create this dynamic and this idea of truth in photography. But I think that there are limitations to it too. We all come to look at photographs and think different things based on our own histories and our own backgrounds and our own, where we grew up, what social class we were a part of. All of our own individual histories change the way we read photographs. And so I think part of what activates these is what you all are bringing to it differently than what I might see when I look at these pictures.
Right. And that leads me to another question. We were talking about this before, this relationship between the photographer and the subject, not just people, but landscapes, whatever. And of course the differences. I'm very curious about that, this relationship that you obviously developed with your subjects. It's evident in these images and with the way that you talk about them, that you got to know them. You weren't just like an outsider walking in and asking if you could take photos of them. But I want to talk a little bit about what might have surprised you, this idea of like how an image can register so many different readings, so many different outcomes by other people who maybe know parts of the story or don't know it. And even some of the residents, after having seen some of these images, what the reception was like.
Sure. I think that, to talk a little bit about the relationship that we had, like I said, I didn't know anyone. I read about what was happening in Treece in a New York Times article that basically made it sound like everyone in the town wanted to leave. The headline of the article was, "Welcome to our town, we wish we weren't here." And and the first article talked about how there was a basic agreement between almost everyone in the town that they all wanted to leave. And when I got there, I realized that wasn't actually the case. But I read this article and I wanted to go because I was really interested in this idea of a community that was okay with the idea of no longer being a community, or they at least came to terms with that idea. And I think that there were a lot of people who knew what was happening in Treece, and there were plenty of reporters who came. There were lots of articles about what happened, and photographers would come and make quick pictures and leave. And I wanted to look at the story in a much more in-depth way and to be there a lot more. When I was in town, like I said, it was weeks at a time. I would go and I'd be in Treece from dawn until dusk photographing and talking to people and learning about them. And I wanted to be able to look at how their identities were shifting over time. And I think coming with a quick picture here and there wouldn't really have done what I was trying to do.
I also want to talk a little bit about how the series looks at this relationship between life and death. This is something you and I discussed. On the one hand, they offer this evidence of the town's unraveling and obviously its eventual demise. But it also depicts people in their homes and their situations, and in that sense, like, they're incredibly valuable because these are not moments that most people would photograph of themselves. We tend to want to photograph things that are positive, celebrations and whatnot. So even having this position of, it celebrates life, it celebrates their experience there, the good and bad, and even some of the neutral situations, like you talked about, the chat, for example, being a part of the landscape and very much a part of everyone's life. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this relationship between life and death and where these images stand, especially because you talked about sort of transforming identities. Were people aware of this as sort of like a saying goodbye, not just to the town, but to like a life? And
Some people definitely were. There were people who I talked to from day one of being there who were in tears, about how difficult this was going to be, and that they weren't sure that they wanted to leave and if they should leave or not. And then there were plenty of people who didn't seem to necessarily see as far in the future, or there were people who were very excited about the opportunity to leave, and that many of them moved to homes where they felt that they were in a nicer place or a safer place, and that this was an opportunity and a good thing for them in lots of ways. But there were definitely people who were very nostalgic even before it actually happened. There was one conversation which I think is really interesting about with the mayor and his wife. And his wife, in the beginning, I think was ready to go and thought a lot about it. And then as things happened and she started to move, she became very upset about it. And every time that I would go back and talk to them, she was, less and less happy about the move and was very upset that she had left. And at one point she was saying that she wished she was still back there and that they hadn't taken the buyout and they hadn't left. And her husband was talking to her about it and, saying that wouldn't it be sort of suicide to stay, knowing what the land was and what the health issues would be to stay there. And I think it was, and she said, no, it's not. And it was interesting. I do think there was sort of a level of clarity between a lot of people that it was actually not a good thing to be there. And again, there were a lot of people who really didn't think it was an issue.
Okay, so I want to follow up on that comment with a question about, or comment about also this idea of how the town represents death in many ways, and this is what really intrigued me about these images, not just the event of like its demise, but also, especially looking at the chat and having that clarity with that satellite image, the Google image that you showed, which to me looks like these like cancerous mounds like enclosing on this town, which is so tiny in comparison. But there is a beauty in those mounds. They're definite in the way you photograph them. They're very beautiful, and they did provide like kind of a landscape, an alternative to the flat land that was in that surrounding area. So I love this dichotomy, but I also wondered if you could speak to this kind of look of death in terms of your images, and just if you have any comments on that.
I think that like every photograph talks about death in so many ways. You are recording something that, as we look at any photograph, we're looking back at something in history, right? And we know, again, you mentioned Barth, and there's a point in Camera Lucida where he's talking about a photograph of Louis Payne that was made when he had attempted to assassinate the Secretary of State. And there was a portrait of him that was made as he was waiting to be hanged. And it's this portrait where Roland Barthes is talking about how this photograph tells of a death in the future. And I think that every photograph tells of a death in the future. And I think my photographs in Treece certainly do to a great extent, right? Because there is this imminent death that is coming. We know this town is no longer going to exist. And then at the same time, as we're looking at these pictures now, the town doesn't exist anymore. So there's this weird trapping of time, I think, as you look at photographs. And I think there is kind of a celebration of life and death in in the images. Like I said, I think some people were excited to leave and some people were very sad to leave. I think there are some images that do feel have a greater link to death to me, specifically, of some of the photographs that I've made. And it is interesting, again, thinking about what some of the residents were aware of and not aware of. And actually, that might bring me to some of the other images that I have up there, if I can show you really quickly. So, as I told you guys, I was, besides making my own photographs, I was collecting a lot of different artifacts and different things that I think help tell the story in a much greater depth. And so this is an installation shot from an exhibition that I had previously, where you can see that I'm bringing in a lot of these artifacts. Some I've re-photographed and some I'm actually just sharing, and some new pieces where I'm exploring ideas of death and sort of fractures in images. These are, I don't have a larger file of them, but these are historical photographs that actually had been ripped through the face of the subjects there, and put those back up. There's things like actually a little mini chat pile here, a mining lamp. This is a bolt from the water tower. And there's a lot of other artifacts that are incorporated in the installation. This is taking satellite images of the block where the water tower used to be. It is right here, and so it's from 1991 going through 2012, and again you can see the water tower in every single image, and then here the one in 2012 is just the bolt, or the area where the water tower had been. This is a personal photograph from someone whose father, someone from Treece whose father is in the mines. There was a grade school in Treece that was built in 1924 and then destroyed by fire in 1968. So I have a handful of school class photographs that I look at, and the basketball team. This is a Safety Pete poster. There were a whole bunch of them with this character of someone trying to remind the miners to be safe as they're working. And I collected a community cookbook from Treece and made some recipes, mining directories, and maps. And in it I have correspondence from people from Treece, or who still live there, and myself. So a letter that Gary wrote me, an email from his wife, and this is what I wanted to bring up. After the buyout and the whole process happened, the trust decided to put up sort of a memorial to the town. So there's this, they referred to it as a memorial, but at the end of this email you can see that she says, "I finally saw the memorial, it looks like a tombstone to me. We'll get a picture taken." And this is a photograph of Gary standing in front of this tombstone. And I thought that that choice of word on her part, or even just to acknowledge the fact that it was this sort of death marker of the town. And this is actually a historical photograph of Treece.
All right, I think we can open it up to some questions. If anybody has questions or comments for either of us.
Hey, thank you for your talk and sharing your photographs. I have a question about the way that the people perceived what was happening to Treece. I'm from a place where it has the same relationship with its founding. So I'm from a place that was founded because it is it's a repository for nuclear waste in New Mexico, and there's this relationship that's kind of ambivalent with that, in that we wouldn't exist as a town if it wasn't for the same thing that is ultimately like could be a huge threat to our existence as a town. And I'm wondering if people there had a kind of this same ambivalent relationship with the town, like knowing that, having, I guess, like knowing that the town wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the mines, and also knowing that the mines are the thing that are going to ultimately put them out.
Right.
Right.
I think that different people in the town felt different ways, for sure. But I do think that there were a lot of people, the people who kind of grew up their whole lives in Treece and had been there forever, and whose parents were the miners and who had learned to drive trucks in the mines and things like that. They had definitely a more romantic idea of the town and the mining, and were definitely more torn about this idea of the mines destroying the land and things like that. There were people who lived in Treece who moved there more recently, and I think that there wasn't as much, and there was definitely more of an ambivalence in that case. I think there are so many towns like this in our country, and I think it's, there's so many things with Flint right now. I'm just, there's so many relationships. I'm thinking about what's happening there a lot. Yeah.
That sounded like a good gateway into the question that I had. This is more of a broad question, I guess, for both of you. But that in your first talk, I just am thinking of my own thoughts, like art being something that should educate and just bring ideas to the public about things that either are overlooked or maybe just not known yet. And then in comparison to the work that you're making and devoting your process to working on such an idea, inside America, would you think that there are enough problems, instead of like in the past, which were like scientific or psychoanalytic about like what we were learning, but that in America there's a lot of environmental and like economical problems that art could be focused towards educating the public at? Is that like, how did you rationalize devoting your process to that type of topic versus like what we learn, at least in undergraduate art education, is more like broad. Like you very specifically devoted your time to working on this type of project. Maybe like, yeah, being integrated into the art community. Like how would you?
You know, I think that there is a very documentary aspect and bent to this work for sure. My interest in it in the beginning was really, again, reading about this town that had decided that they didn't want to exist anymore, or that they had come to terms with the idea of no longer being a community anymore. So from my artistic, you know, bent or side, I guess I would say, I was really interested in investigating this shift in their identities throughout the process, and that my previous work was, I have photographed a number of other communities in a more literal documentary sense, but throughout it I'm always thinking about this idea of how we present ourselves to a camera and how we understand ourselves through photography. And so I do think that that is a huge aspect of this work. I am very much, you know, enmeshed in the story of the environmental issues, the political issues, everything that's going on in this, that went on in Treece. And I think that, you know, there are days where I want to go to Flint or to another town and keep making work that's like this, and there are days where I want to spend more time thinking about the identity aspects of it. So I think there are plenty of, obviously many, many other stories that could be investigated or looked at and shared through an art context.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question as a photographer. Considering you were documenting the process, what role do you think you took on? Were you more of like documentation for a historical context, or documentation in its own right? But how did you, like, what role do you think you took on? Were you part of the destruction of the town, or were you in a way salvaging it? And how did you allow yourself to remain distant from your subjects even while taking an interest, or like how did it impact you?
It's a great question. I established relationships with people in the community there are some people who I still talk to frequently and email with all the time. I don't think of myself as a photojournalist or a documentarian. I don't think that this work is objective by any ways. It's a response, or it's a record of my experience meeting these people and being in this town and learning things about them. So I don't think that this is just this sort of archive only of the community. I do think it functions that way and can function that way, as long as there's an understanding that it's biased, right? Because it's me and one individual person coming and making these photographs. I think it was really hard to distance myself from what was happening. I mean, it was emotional for me to watch what everybody was going through, and obviously it wasn't something that was directly happening to me. There were plenty of times where I was doing things where my camera was not being used. You know, I had dinner with a lot of people. I went on my first motorcycle ride in Treece in flip-flops and a dress, and I haven't been on one since. My husband was taken fly fishing in Treece or nearby, and I think that I was definitely interested in establishing relationship, not fly fishing, just fishing. I was interested in establishing relationships and getting to know people, and I think that to me changes the work. I think that if I didn't invest more of my own energy and genuinely care about what was happening there and the people who I met, then the pictures would be very different. Yeah, does that answer the question? Yeah. Sure.
You had mentioned a kind of like truth in photography. When being a photographer or writing about photography even, do you think about how Photoshop or manipulated photos have influenced like our relationship to photos themselves, or how we look at photographs now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of argument of photographic truth is, I think, maybe I'm just too enmeshed in the art world, not quite as strong anymore, because people realize that a photograph isn't pure truth, right? It is a record of what existed in front of your camera at a certain moment in time, right? So I can make a photograph of you right now, and yes, you were sitting there in a black sweater and have braids and bangs, and that happened, but the truth and the actual understanding of who you are and your identity is not going to be part of that photograph, really. We're all going to look at it and come up with our own ideas of who you are, but it's not necessarily actually there. I always talk to my students about Richard Avedon, who, when he did this series called In the American West, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, he was photographing among a number of towns in the American West, and showed these large portraits in the Amon Carter Museum in Texas at first, and he was he had gotten sort of mixed reviews because he wasn't showing like the brawny cowboys and rosy-cheeked, people that people thought you would see in the West. That he was showing drifters and coal miners and oil field workers and things like that, and so people thought that he was, maybe taking advantage of people who were down and out. And he got all of these mixed reviews. And what he said was, he heard his critics, and what he said was, all photographs are accurate, and none of them is truth. And I think that that's a really interesting to think about always, or it's something I think about all the time with my images. And that the truth is different based on whoever's looking at them. Anything else?
Should take one or two last questions.
You talk a little bit about how you also show like antiques and sort of artifacts you pick up from the town. What differences do you think exist between, say, like showing the bolt of a water tower or taking a photographic image of a water tower?
Did everybody hear that? I think that there's a difference between showing the actual artifact itself and making a new photograph of it, for sure. I liked exploring and playing with both. So as you saw, I photographed some photos or different things on chat itself to show a direct relationship between, this family snapshot and the chat, which is what, basically is a symbol of the death of the town. But then some things I did rephotograph and some things I wanted to show in person. I think showing the water tower's bolt itself maybe allows a viewer to think more about the reality of it and the tactility of it. If you think that you actually could walk up and pick it off the shelf and say, this was, what held up this water tower that is no longer in existence, that's going to feel differently than looking at an image. And so I like the play of having both of them in the work itself. I'm smiling because I have 2 young children, and my husband is like, we're not flying back there very soon. If he's not listening, would love to head over there for like a quick weekend and make some pictures of the land now with the grass really high and nothing happening to it right now. I do love this sort of the empty land images that I've already created, and I do feel like in terms of making new images, I could easily be done. If I had time, I might go and make another picture or 2, but I do feel like it's definitely in a place where I'm working on the book and having it ready out in the way it is. I think this is a story that like 20 years from now, I could go make a new picture and follow up with people in their new homes again and see what happened and see how things change. So, and I think that's happened with every kind of work I've made. So I think there's a point where I feel like this is it, and I'm good with it.
Anything else? All right, thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Natasha.